Welcome, everyone, to the third annual Lone Star Lecture Series. The Lone Star Lecture Series is part of the Distinguished Speaker Series here at Angelo State University, and it hosts outside scholars of Texas history to deliver a keynote address coinciding with the anniversary of Texas independence in March of each year, which was just March 2nd. So it is presented by the Dr. Arnaldo de Leon Department of History here at ASU and is funded by the Dorsey B. Hardiman Endowed Chair in History. We would ask members from the San Angelo community who are here tonight to sign our Friends of the Lone Star Series form with your name and email address, so that way you can stay informed about next year's talk. We are thrilled to announce this year's speaker, Dr. Leah LaGrone, who will present her talk, Sex Wages, Race, Respectability, and Minimum Wage Policies in Texas. After her presentation, we'll open the floor for questions from you all, from the audience. Dr. LaGrone is from East Texas. She holds a PhD in history from Texas Christian University. She's currently an assistant professor of history and public history director at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah. She's thrilled to be back in Texas. She's already had plenty of Mexican food, and she brought the rain with her, so we might not let her back on the plane. So Dr. LaGrone specializes in women and gender, the borderlands, and labor studies. She has contributed an essay to an anthology about Texas Governor James Ferguson, as well as scholarly articles to the Washington Post and Texas Monthly. She has also worked on several public history projects, including the Civil War documentary, Civil Rights in Black and Brown, and the Texas Historical Association's Handbook of Texas Women. Her current book project, which we'll hear about, under contract with the University of Oklahoma Press, is titled Sex Wages, The Fight Over Minimum Wage in Texas, 1919 to 1923. So please join me in welcoming Dr. LaGrone.
Okay, I'm going to set my timer so that I don't go way over or start going off on tangents, which I am known for. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here. I want to thank Michael and Jason and Yulia for helping me get out here. It was quite the ordeal coming from Salt Lake City, Utah to San Angelo. But I want to thank you all for coming out. I am going to start where historians usually stop.
Oh, that was bad. Hold it like that.
Okay, there we go. There we go. They don't train us in these. So historians usually start, end our discussions with why our history matters, why our scholarship matters, and what we do. I'm going to begin it, mainly because, and even just today, I visited Miss Hattie's brothel, or bordello, as they like to class it up a little bit. And when I told people that I am a historian of prostitution, automatically get the, wait, what? Prostitution? Like, how do you get into prostitution? And so how I got into prostitution was lots of reading about morality, women's morality, what that means, and started researching how that is connected with the types of jobs, the types of salary that women earn, right? And one of the ways that I explain why my work matters is the article that I wrote for the Washington Post for Made by History. So right during the pandemic, as we were shut down and the federal government started giving out the small business loans, I read this news article about how small business loans were not going to be given to women in the sex industry, particularly exotic dance clubs or strip clubs because the law or the bill for this small business loan relief specifically excluded immoral businesses, which ties directly into what I do with connecting prostitution to low wages and morality to pay, especially for women. Why I say especially for women and what I argue here is that the business owners, men, mostly men, they were able to get the small business loans. They hired the dancers. The dancers are independent contractors. And so because they're independent contractors, they're considered to having their own businesses within this business, this larger business. The male proprietors could get the loans. The women who did the work could not, the labor. And so that's how I connected it to this larger historical context. So basically what I'm saying is that we're still having these conversations on connecting morality to wages, especially for women, and why this is important. So how do we connect morality and wages? It's very large up here. I've never seen it quite this large. But early 1900s reformers, I'm from the late 1900s, just so you know, they attacked the sex industry and with the population of prostitutes, blamed the women for the state of their perceived immorality. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, morality and immorality was seen as something that was inherent, especially within the poor whites especially. And as part of the late 19th century social Darwinism, the wealthy often viewed poverty as a punishment for moral failings of the individual. Then for context, you have the social gospel as progressive reformers start to talk about uplifting society as a whole by uplifting the poor. And so the social gospel response to the social Darwinist idea, and I'm going to look down here instead of up here all the time, is this socially constructed, or it's the opposite of how they viewed immorality, and is socially constructed by the middle and upper classes to reflect their views on purity, womanhood, and this is a symptom of poverty, not the cause of poverty. And so that's how this larger discussion is going to shift and create this larger narrative. I found this quote by George Bernard Shaw, and yes, George Bernard Shaw is not up here, but it's really sums up this larger movement that connects prostitution and low wages in order to get legislation for a protective minimum wage for women. And this is really the idea of what progressive reformers began to adopt, this mantra, if you will, of what progressive reformers adopted. People did not experience poverty because they were immoral. Rather, immorality is forced upon them because they are poor. And so this also goes into that larger conversation about prostitution in general. Is this a choice? Did the women, is this an agency, a choice that they're making? And I explore that conversation. I don't really get into it, but I do use an argument from this same time period that it can be labeled as a choice. You either die of starvation or choose to commodify your body. So it's a false choice, right? It's a choice forced upon you. And so this is kind of the larger narrative of this time period. But we're going to come back to this quote pretty often. So right now, I'm just going to riff on the larger context of this minimum wage movement that connected prostitution to low wages. And then we'll get into Texas specifically. We're going to kind of go around the nation and come back to Texas. So I'm going to start with this one and go back to the other one. So in 1910, this is after you have this big federal law called the Mann Act. Anybody heard of the Mann Act? So of 1910. So this is a response, a progressive reformers' response to prostitution. And it's a federal law that criminalizes people taking women across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes. It was problematic. Two of the examples that I ent of why it was problematic was the boxer Jack Johnson, a black man who was married to a white woman, went across state lines with his white wife. He was arrested and charged under the Mann Act. And that was completely racially motivated. Another way that they used the Mann Act was to charge women and men who traveled together, specifically labor organizing. So a lot of the Wobblies, International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, there was quite a few of them because often men and women traveled together. So in order to kind of punish these labor organizers, they were arrested and charged under the Mann Act, assuming that these men were escorting these women, the working class women, across state lines for immoral purposes. The Mann Act was not used very often for its actual purpose. But it was a moral panic, right? Why did we have this moral panic? And I'll come back to this. I have some pretty interesting, this is where I get into numbers. I'm not really a numbers person, but I think they tell a really good story if you really look at them. Why did this moral panic start in the first place? Progressive reformers love their conferences. They love their surveys. They love sending people into these slum areas to do research, right? And so part of this is going to come from this Chicago Vice Commission report, and I'll go back to that in just a minute. But what was the moral panic? The moral panic was, now that we have industrialization, right? And we have these cities that are getting the, trains are coming through, factories are being built, all of this industry is coming to these cities. Now you have women, native-born white women, let me be specific, coming into the cities looking for work. You have, from rural areas, you also have immigrants, loads and loads of immigrants coming into the nation to capitalize on industry. It was very limited, though. Women and their work, they could go into factories, garment factories, work piecemeal. They could do steam laundry. Steam laundries was a huge industry here. And other very low-paying jobs. Black women across the nation were relegated even further to lower-paying jobs. And then as we get into Texas, you'll see that Mexican women, the same, relegated to very low-paying jobs. That was not the moral panic. The moral panic was around white women moving into the cities, especially from rural areas, going into the cities, and the fear of madams or procurers from brothels, meeting them at the train station and then bringing them into brothels and capturing them in the brothels and making them work in the sex industry. So that was the whole moral panic. And around that moral panic, they did tons of research that, of course, then helps me. So what you see here is borders. So one of the ways that they're tracking women adrift, and by the term women adrift, I mean single women moving into the city who do not have a moral compass. Does anybody know what that moral compass consists of? A man, right? So they're moving away from their dads, their brothers, any other male protector that gives them their moral compass. Let's not talk about how many women were sexually abused by men in their family and then labeled as fallen women. And so in order to make money after you're labeled a fallen woman, you commodify your body. But we won't talk about that. So the fear is these women adrift, specifically white women adrift. And so by city, because a lot of these cities are going to form their own vice commission. Did I just go out? Can you all still hear me? Okay. They're going to form their own vice commission. So what you see is women moving to cities, going to boarding houses. Fun fact, brothels were also labeled as boarding houses. So that was one of the fears. But you can see these numbers. And with these numbers staring them in the face, it became a real, we really need to do something about this because women are susceptible to falling into prostitution for not being paid a living wage. Then you go to marital status. It's a real fear that by 1910, the average age of single women is still 29. They're not getting married and having babies. They're not getting married, and so they're not connected to a man who is their moral compass, right? But is it just young single women? No. So separated and divorced, widowed, all of these women, especially white women, I need to point out, it's a real fear that they may turn to prostitution to be able to survive. Why? Men are not only considered the moral compass, men are considered the economic center of these women's lives. They don't make as much money as men because men are considered the breadwinners. Women's income is supplemental. Even back in this time, women were fighting, middle-class white women were fighting for equal pay for equal work. So that's a term that's been around for a long time. So, excuse me, I have not talked like this in a while. Why white women? The numbers here tell me a great story. Black women this is 1880 to 1910. The majority of Black women are still living in rural areas of the South. This is before your Great Migration is taking place. Women are moving into these Black women are moving into these larger cities, but the percentage is not there yet. And I don't know specifically where this sample is taken from. It could just be taken from certain areas that have already segregated Black women and white women, and so they didn't go into these larger Black populations. But what this does tell me here, foreign-born white, native-born white, with foreign-born parents or native-born parents. So this is the time period here that progressive reformers are bringing foreign-born white-skinned women into the umbrella of whiteness. And so it becomes imperative to protect white women, especially when you look at this numbers, the fear of white slavery. So women being forced into the sex industry, white women. What's really helpful to me in my own research is that in 1890 census is pretty much burned up, so we don't have a lot of that. And the 1900 census, prostitution is listed as an occupation. And so that's really helpful to me. Only because then I have to use the 1910 census, I have to go back to the 1900 and the 1880s to see who the madams were. And then I can trace them and I'm like, oh, you're probably still a madam, right? And your boarders are sex workers. But you can see the occupations that are available to women. Prostitute, 4%. That's a big deal. 4% is a big deal, especially when you, like the laundresses, the saleswomen, they're only a couple of percent numbers higher. School teachers are 4%. These are women who are on the edge of what they consider legitimate jobs and falling into prostitution because they don't get paid very much. So let's go back to my other discussion. So with all those numbers in mind, a lot of cities did. Chicago's Vice Commission report was the most famous. Once they published in 1911, it became a bestseller. People loved reading about sex work. But the Vice Commission had this one paragraph in their report that sent both progressive reformers and businessmen over the edge in different directions. The businessmen actually tried to get this paragraph removed from the report, and the progressive reformers latched onto it and ran with it for a new outlook on prostitution, on the abolition of prostitution. Spoiler alert, neither the Mann Act or this actually ended prostitution. But they tried. They were trying to make these legitimate efforts. But when the Chicago went into the Levee District, which was the most famous red light district in the United States at the time. So the Levee District in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, very powerful madams there. The political machines ran these areas. Madams paid off the political machines. There was a lot of power coming out of this red light district. Progressive reformers sent some investigators down to the red light district to investigate the sex industry. Like, hey, what y'all doing? What's going on? Let me talk to you. Let me buy you a drink. That's a song, by the way. And so they came up, just by talking to some women in the red light district, they came up with this idea that most of the women that have fallen, soiled doves, if you will, did so because the industries that women could work in were paying what they called starving wages. And so women had the choice to either starve or commodify their body. There's and so this caused all kinds of upheaval in discussions around protective wages. for women. So in 1913, Chicago, the Lieutenant Governor Barrett O'Hara, who ran in the Progressive Party on the Progressive ticket, he formed his own white slavery commission with the state of Illinois in order to specifically get a federal law that was about protective wages, to have a federal minimum wage law for women to keep them from going into prostitution. He held these hearings in Chicago. His hearings are some of the only hearings that I have found where they actually allowed women from the red light district to testify. So he got so angry, Barrett O'Hara got so angry at the business owners for denying that paying $4 a week to women, that doesn't make them immoral. They're just inherently immoral. And if they weren't immoral, then they would rather die than sell their body. And so Barrett O'Hara got so angry that he sent his sergeant at arms to the levee district to round up some women and bring them in. Caused all kinds of controversy. But this one woman that is identified as AR, they only use their initials, she told the committee, she said, I worked in a steam laundry until I was 24 years old, making $4 a week. I now work in a brothel for $40 a week. I send my children to boarding school, to private boarding school. Yes, I don't have contact with my children. No, I can never see my children again, but my children will not experience poverty. My children will be able to get out of this cycle and go on and make a living. And so that's how she really justified what she was, choosing to go into the sex industry. It made a huge impact. And so for a woman that worked in the red light district to make an impact on this national discussion is huge. And so by 1913, now because of the first Chicago Vice Commission report and then these white slavery commissions, I told you progressives love their commissions, it starts a movement. It starts a national movement that's connecting prostitution, abolition of prostitution, to low wages paid to women. And then you get the West. So the West, as you can see here, where women could already vote for these kinds of laws, these Western states are going to pick up this progressive platform and they are going to start passing their own laws, whether they were a flat rate of minimum wage or industrial welfare commissions or just a labor commission. But all of these states here are going to pass some form of minimum wage for women. And then you've got Texas. Let me go back. None of these states here had exclusions to their laws on minimum wage. Now, they did specify them for certain industries. It is understood that these laws are for white women, for, white women to have access to this minimum wage, but it's not coded in their laws. And then there's Texas, right? And then there's Texas. Now, I use this tree planting region map because it's the only one I could find that was broken up into regions, but it really is indicative of these other regions that are other types of regions that are going to pop up. So in 1919, no, 1913, 1915, and then again in 1919, Texas is trying to get this progressive reform passed, these protective wage laws. They got the protective hours laws passed. Now they're trying to get the protective wage laws passed. But this brings up, for historians, that age-old question. You know what that is about Texas? Is Texas the West or is it the South? It's a great question. But I don't really engage in it other than saying that Texas brought in Western ideas. They were looking at the West saying, look at what these Western states can do, especially if women can vote. Look at what they can do. Let's bring in these progressive ideas that the West is passing into our states. But Texas politics and social norms of the time are deeply rooted in the Jim Crow South. Deeply rooted in the Jim Crow South. Most of your politicians are kind of come from this eastern corridor. If you've ever been to East Texas, you can't tell the difference between Louisiana, Alabama, and East Texas, right, geographically. And so it's very much rooted in Jim Crow politics. And so Texas wants to pass these minimum wage laws for women, protective wage laws for women. So in 1919, the Labor Commissioner T.C. Jennings, and I think I have a picture of him. There he is. T.C. Jennings stands up before Congress and says, the number one imperative thing that we have to do this legislative session is get this passed. Get this legislation, this protective wage for women, passed. And by 1919, they started agreeing with him, right? Wasn't it that women could vote in state politics? We talked about that. Annie Webb Blanton here, whose name is on a building at the University of Texas at Austin, before women could even vote, she was voted in as the first woman superintendent of all schools of Texas. So she's over the education system. Let me tell you a little bit of something about Annie Webb Blanton. For the Texas education system, she wanted an English-only curriculum, right? She also was part of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so she was very adamant about being part of the Old South, right? She is a lost causer. And so her politics and T.C. Jennings' politics, while they are labor-minded and, wanting to protect the working class, it is very much about protecting white women in the working class. Even T.C. Jennings, who seems to be really progressive. Now, this is where this map comes back into play. So in 1919, after the minimum wage law is passed and the Industrial Welfare Commission is formed with T.C. Jennings, and Annie Webb Blanton, and then somebody else named Hunt, but he doesn't last very long, and I couldn't find a picture of him. But he represented the business owners, so we're not going to talk about him anyway. Annie Webb Blanton was supposed to represent the working class women, which is really interesting since she was from an upper class white family. And then T.C. Jennings represents labor. One of the things that the Industrial Welfare Commission is going to propose is that to appease the white Southerners that are worried about this minimum wage law and oh, my thing went blank there, so I'm going to keep looking up here. This minimum wage law is to divide the state up into zones. Okay, to pay certain zones of women more than other zones. Can you guess which zone was the lowest paid? South and West Texas. And that's where we're going to get into the discussion of Mexican women. So again, I argue in my larger project that Texas is an interesting case study for this particular law and this legislation, because there is like this racial triangulation that they are contending with, which a lot of your other southern states have this like black-white binary that they're addressing. You also have Mexican Americans in Texas who on paper are racially white. The Texas business owners along the border, along these zones, are going to make a concerted effort to separate Mexicanness from whiteness, particularly around this law. And that's what I argue. Now, Jim Crow politics for Black women, shout out to Rebecca Sharpless, who was my dissertation advisor, who wrote 2 books that were really important to my research. Black women are excluded from the beginning. So when white legislators, the men of Texas, write this law, the first time this law was written by 2 people from East Texas, one from Hemphill, one from Houston. I theorized that they were working together because Hemphill rural women were moving into Houston looking for work. And so it's part of this moral panic. The 2, they didn't say in the legislation that Black women were excluded. What they did is they coded it in the exclusion of certain industries. The other states of the West only had what industries were included. Texas not only had what was included, but also who was excluded. Specifically, who was excluded. So how did they do that? Domestic workers and farm and ranch labor workers were excluded. We're specifically looking at East Texas, North and East Texas, North Texas, East Texas. Guess who was relegated to those industries? Black women, right? And so they're going to be excluded from access to this law. The Industrial Welfare Commission in 1919, let me go back to our states. In 1919, they are going to set out on a campaign to study the industries of Texas. Okay, how much are we doing? Good on time? Studying the industries of Texas. So what they did is they are going to go to places like Houston. Houston was first. Then they're going to go to Dallas. And then they're going to go to Waco. And that's all of Texas, right? That's all we have to study. Those 3 cities can tell us everything we need to know about Texas. And Mexican women in El Paso said, not so fast. Not so fast. We know what's going on. We're reading the newspapers. Spanish language newspapers are printing this as well. You need to come to El Paso. Workers in Laredo said, you need to come to Laredo and study our industries as well. And so in October, the Industrial Welfare Commission went to Houston to do their first hearings. By the end of that month, Mexican American women in El Paso are organizing a strike, a laundry strike. They get over 500 women to walk out of the laundry in El Paso not only demanding the minimum wage, demanding more money, but this is going to get the attention of the Industrial Welfare Commission. And so the Industrial Welfare Commission, they're like, okay, we will go out to El Paso. When they do, it's going to change the narrative. It's going to change this shift in how progressive reformers at the time are going to talk about this connection between prostitution and the minimum wage legislation. It's going to be less about protecting white supremacy through protecting white women with wages and protecting white supremacy by denying Black and brown women access to a living wage. Because what comes with economic security? Political power. Political power. And so this walkout, and this is the only time that I'm going to read because I think it's really important that you know that these women are standing up for themselves. So for context, I want to point out that in 1919, this is the same time as the Canales hearings. Have you heard about the Canales hearings? I think last year's speaker, Dr. Lavario, talked about the Porvenir massacre conducted by the Texas Rangers. That sparked the Canales hearing. So Canales was the only Mexican American in Texas Congress. He and other Mexican Americans along the border, middle-class Mexican Americans, knew about these Texas Ranger atrocities that were happening and ordered an investigation. So this is kind of the dynamic and the politics along the border at the time. So that's for context. Now, what you have for this time period is a whole bunch of white people, white men especially, business entrepreneurs, coming into West Texas, especially along the border, and starting businesses, right? Hiring Mexican women, especially as, quote, cheap labor. With the railroads that are coming through, that are being built, more and more of this white movement into the West is happening. Again, for context. Now, when the Industrial Welfare Commission gets to El Paso, the first people to testify in front of the commission are going to be white employers. White employers, especially of steam laundry, because that's where this big strike happened, are going to argue, because the state of Texas excluded Black women, that Mexican women also needed to be excluded. And their reasoning. So this is the part that I'm going to read because I think it's really important. So the business owners elected F.B. Fletcher to read a statement that he prepared from the heads of Acme, El Paso, Troy, and Elite Laundry. Fletcher stated that his testimony covered the position of the local employers and emphasized three basic concerns. The first was the, quote, unusual local conditions of female workers in El Paso, end quote. He stressed that Mexican women, who made up a good portion of the workforce, lived in, quote, lower class lifestyle than white women. They used beans and rice and tortillas as an example. Next, he addressed the notion that the employers wanted to present their own, quote, reliable and certified data, implying that the commission should not trust the data collected by their own investigator. And last, he thought that the commissioners should know that the, quote, efficiency of women's labor, meaning Mexican women, in El Paso was significantly less than that of the American, meaning white. I want to emphasize that the language used here is threefold: American, Mexican, and Black. So Black women are not even put into the American category. Mexican women, whether they were in Texas for generations, are not put into the American category. So American identity, and the label of American becomes a euphemism for white. And it's all in this language being presented here. So Fletcher read this prepared statement claiming, quote, "The American and Mexican cannot justly be placed on the same footing." He's going to continue. "El Paso naturally accumulated a large amount of unskilled labor. We are confronted with the deep-seated difference in temperament existing between the Anglo-Saxon and mixed Latin races. The difference between the progressiveness and initiativeness," I don't know what that's, and energy of the former and the backwardness of the Mexican. There seems to be no material desire to learn, to understand, to develop and progress. In some plants, well-defined and intelligent efforts at welfare work have been persistently made and have been met with indifference and distrust. I wonder why, right? White women will not use the restroom because of fear of stealing. Mexicans are not steady workers and rarely rise to a responsible position. No mention of their not being promoted purposefully. My statement is not an indictment of Mexican workers, just plain facts. Women workers, specifically Mexican workers, Mexican women here, I do want to emphasize that they were standing up for themselves, not only through these walkouts, but they testified. They testified about being exploited, about making half of what white women workers in El Paso were working, and their testimony through an interpreter, Clemente Ibar, who was the South and West Texas head of the American Federation of Labor in Texas at the time. He comes out to El Paso to translate for Spanish-speaking women. And so Maria Valles, and so I want to read this part too so I can make sure that I'm giving their voice to this topic. Maria Valles, in her testimony, she asserted that I work at Elite Laundry for $4.50 a week. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and some days I have to go without food so that she can eat. Manuela Hernandez told the commission that she was the highest paid Mexican worker at Acme Laundry, but that employers paid American women more, American meaning white. She testified most Mexican women only made between $4 and $6 a week in the laundries. Espina Silva, Maria Santos, Bendencia Garcia, they all worked at El Paso Laundry, but quit during the strikes in October of 1919 to protest the low wages. All three stated that they lived at home. So they used this privilege to quit and help lead this organized effort. But other women couldn't do that. So Guadalupe Espejo, she told the commission, I work at a laundry for $7 a week on the collar machine. My child has 2 pair of shoes that I bought in installments, and my coat is 10 years old. And then the last working woman to testify, Spanish-speaking working woman, was Eloise Alcala. And she lived with her sister and her sister's children. And she stood up and told T.C. Jennings, the only fair wage to pay women in this city is $25 a week. T.C. Jennings looked at her and said, what would you do with all that money? She said, I would buy groceries. I would buy groceries. This was really impactful. However, the business owner statements were given more authority. And so the Texas legislature went back in 2021 reworked the legislation to exclude Mexican women. It became so convoluted. Also, I do want to point out that Black women were not given the right to testify for their own voice to be in these hearings. But for these testimonies, while they were powerful to a lot of the public, especially the progressive public, the legislature, all men, all white men, except for Kamala's, did not think so. So they reworked the law, reworked it, dismissed the IWC, created this law that was so convoluted that by the time it did pass, but by the time it landed on Pat Neff's desk, he vetoed it, saying that it constituted class legislation. So protecting, basically, I guess that's super political, but basically what we're seeing in some of the legislation that we see now, in this would give too much advantage to working class people. And we don't want that advantage to lift them above white men, because then they would be oppressed, right? And so he vetoes it. It goes away. By 1923, you have a contest to challenge these laws. So Adkins versus Children's Hospital in 1923 goes in front of the Supreme Court. In a 4-3 decision, they rule it unconstitutional. That you cannot have a law specific to women, specific to working class women, that gives them an unfair advantage. And so by 1923, you have this talk of minimum wage legislation going away until the Great Depression. And so my epilogue to my larger project talks about the legacy of the 1919 legislation and the exclusion of Black women specifically, but Black and Mexican women. So the connections that I make are some very powerful men. John Nance Garner, Cactus Jack, right? Martin Dies Jr., and Joseph Mansfield, J.J. Mansfield. All part of legislatures when this 1919 bill was passed in Texas, all part of the anti-labor movement, anti-Black, anti-immigrant movement that's happening at this time. But there is a real discussion about the Great Depression and New Deal legislation of getting this law, this Fair Labor and Standards Law, passed. But how do we do that? How do we do that? Because the South, the legislatures of the South are like, absolutely not. Because this gives, again, with economic security comes political power, right? So what do? What model do we have? What model do we have? How do we write this bill to exclude Black and Mexican people? Bonk. Texas. Texas powerful legislators say, hey, we have an idea. We've already done this in 1919, right? And so they do. They passed the Fair Labor and Standards Act. For reference, I put in here that the 25 cents an hour that was originally passed is equivalent to $5.41 in 2023. Increased to 30 cents, which is about $6.59, which is not too far off from the minimum wage that we have now. And of $7.25, if, of course, we kept pace, and this is, I just plugged this into Google calculator and it did it for me, it's about $10.31, right? And so, it broadens the discussion, right? Of morality and living wages and poverty. And this larger discussion of how we talk about not only women's wages, but how it's still racially coded, how, if I go all the way back to the beginning of my PowerPoint, how it's still morally coded, and who gets access. So that's my larger argument, that's my larger project, and it's still an unanswered question. Yeah? So thank you. Do we have time for questions? I think I went over.
That's not question.
There we are. All right, any questions?
Fine.
So I saw a statistic on one of your charts earlier talking about the population of women that are in Chicago, and the minimum age it started with was 15.
Slow down so I can understand. Go ahead.
So on one of your charts, you had the statistic of the number of women in Chicago, and the minimum age was 15. I'm wondering if there was any particular fervor against prostitution for underage girls at that time, or was it just grouped with?
That's a great question. And I'm going to answer it like this. There was a discussion largely of what even was underage, right? Many of your young women that are moving into the big cities are going to be 14, 15, and 16. Understand that at the same time, progressive reformers are also fighting for an age of consent law. So in a lot of your states, the age of consent is 12.
Oh.
So women are considered sexually viable and able to be married off to men at 12 years old. And so, which then is interpreted as that's not underage, right? 12 years old is of age. And so at the same time that there's this moral panic about young women, and I use that term loosely, moving into the cities looking for work, there's also that discussion of raising the age of consent to 18. And so which would then make 18, anything under 18, a minor. Does that help answer the question a little bit? There was a concern, but they couldn't say that these were underage girls at 14, 15, and 16 because legally they weren't.
Other questions?
So when you talked about sort of what jobs were coded as like black or whatnot, can you give like more of a description of like what jobs those were? Like I imagine domestic was one of them, or like maybe a cotton picker. What was that? What were they really?
I coded, and then what was the other part of the question? The sound system is.
Oh, sorry. Like what were the coded jobs? Like in what were they?
Mostly the coded jobs are going to be the ranches farm labor. So, black women working in cotton farms North Texas and the black, what they call the Black Prairie. And then, of course, in South Texas, working in those types of farm industries and domestic labor. Because in Texas, black women were not hired into different industries. Put the industries that other women, white women, and some Mexican women could work in. So there were a few steam laundries that in Houston, say, that were hiring Black women to work. They argued, or they lobbied for steam laundries to be coded as domestic labor, since it was laundry, so that any part of the industry that was hiring Black women, they wouldn't have to pay a minimum wage to Black women. And so the legislature understood that Black women would only be hired in these specific jobs, and by excluding these jobs, that made it even more likely that it would only be Black women that would occupy those jobs, because if other industries were included in the wages, then they wouldn't hire Black women. They would only hire white women, because that was who they were trying to protect, right? So then it would become even more relegated. And while it's coded, they knew exactly what they were doing. And the reason that I know that is because of all the news articles that says, don't worry, folks, this is only for white women, right? So let's pass the legislation.
Other questions?
How are you?
So whenever you're have your chart up there and it's saying like foreign white women, what specifically are they saying or targeting?
We go back right here.
Yes.
Okay, and what was the question?
What specific? Are they like German, Dutch coming in? Is it Asian? Is it?
No, it's mostly your Central and Western European. So during, you had a lot of like your British and Scottish are coming over in earlier time periods, but with the Industrial Revolution and the cities that are industrializing, you're getting a lot of more Mediterranean area. You're getting Greeks and Italians and Polish and Russian and German, some German, and in the beginning of the Progressive Era, they are racially coded. So foreign immigrants from these areas are considered non-white. But the population of native-born white is dwindling. And so what are you going to do to have a, quote, white population grow? You're going to Americanize. This is where the Americanization ideas are starting to form as well. Eugenics, how are we going to broaden the idea of whiteness? This is why taking away the whiteness status for Mexican women is so important. And now you have stats like this coming out that says foreign-born white. So now it's bringing anybody with white skin, coded white skin, into this larger umbrella of whiteness. And so now they get to claim, they claim that whiteness, and they're given the same types of privileges as native-born white women.
This is kind of a two-part question. First of all, were some of these minority women, when they would go to work for the brothels, were they ever arrested or have any criminal punishment thrown against them? And if they did, would you say that contributed to the fire that was these protests that were being carried out around the state in response to the 1919 legislation?
So, minority women, no. Having studied a lot of red light districts, historian of prostitution here, having studied red light districts across the state, the majority of sex workers in these red light districts were white women. Foreign born or native born, they were white women. Very few black women were sex workers. Several of the ones who worked in the sex industry, black women became madams, which was a whole different controversy, especially when you have black women over white prostitutes. The fear was that they would allow black men access to white women. And even though that these were sex workers, the idea of black men having sex with white women was more than some could handle. And so there was a concerted effort to try to segregate brothels, segregate red light districts. I have a great quote. I told them, my hosts the other night, I have a great quote from Houston that said that they wanted to segregate red light districts because they did not want the vice district to be an example of integration, like integration working, right? I have some madams that were light-skinned black women changing their racial designation to white, so that they could continue to operate their brothels. But the minority population, minority as in black and Mexican in red light district, is minuscule. So it's minuscule. So the fear, and which sparked the legislation, sparked the fear because they see, based on this statistical evidence, they see that the majority of women working in the sex industry are white women. If they were black women or Mexican women, this legislation probably wouldn't have even, this legislation probably wouldn't have even come up. But this is about protecting white women.
We have time for one more question, I think.
I can do two if you want.
I'm gonna leave third away. Okay. So I have a question about two events in the 19 teens and the ways that they would change demographics. Question of how they might have changed demographics in Texas and how that might have changed the conversation about minimum wage for women. One would be the impact of World War I and then the aftermath of World War I with regards to the Great Migration. And then my other question would be about the Mexican Revolution itself, and those first labor contracts that come out of the first Bracero program and the ways that that would have changed the demographics in cities in Texas, that you have more incoming Black and Mexican women coming into Texas, and how by 1919, that might be a different conversation than it would have been in 1910.
Absolutely. And so this is a big conversation. We're also talking about Houston. So there's not a huge Houston and Dallas. There's not a huge decline in Black population there. There is, of course, in the rural areas, but Houston especially has a very powerful Black middle class. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly at all, really, the red light district by 1908 is put in Freedmantown, so the 4th Ward in Houston, which is where Black men and women, especially middle class Black men and women, live at the time. And so it does affect the conversation of what's happening with the Great Migration. But you in Texas, especially in East Texas in these parts, you still have a very large number of Black men and women living in these cities. They are segregated, of course, but a very powerful Black middle class as well. I've got tons of Black preachers that are talking about having the red light district there, that are talking about this progressive reform for their own women. They're starting, YWCAs. They're starting travel aid to protect their own girls from falling into prostitution as well. The Mexican Revolution is a big part of the discussion in my larger project, but because it's important to understand the dynamics of the violence on the border, especially the violence towards Mexican men and Mexican women, the labeling of especially of Mexican men, Mexican American men as bandits. And so there's this like larger effort to socially criminalize, where even if they couldn't legally criminalize all Mexican and Mexican Americans that lived on the border or were coming across the border because of the revolution, they could socially criminalize them by labeling them bandits. And so that's part of my my larger discussion, because it is really important to the discussion about women and Mexican women being excluded because they don't want the white business owners especially are arguing that by giving Mexican women a living wage, contributing to the family wage, that white supremacy will be damaged in Texas because of the political power that comes with it. So protecting white supremacy overall means denying Black and brown people a living wage. That protects white supremacy more than keeping white women out of prostitution. So that becomes that larger shift that the Great Migration and the Mexican Revolution contribute to.
Thank you.
One final question.
Could you explain how Asian women were factored to the discussion of immorality? Because you mentioned that in most states other than Texas, there was that binary between white and Black, but how were Asian women or Asian people classified within that discussion?
So in the West, they are not mentioned in any of this legislation that I can find. I don't really study the West as much, but most of the legislation that I can find, Asian women are not mentioned. As far as Texas, another project that I have going on at the same time, please somebody tell me to stop, is the steam laundries, right? So we talked a little bit about the steam laundries. But one of the main reasons to get steam laundries into Texas was to push out the Asian laundries, Asian men. Because by the time you get to, 1869, so Transcontinental Railroad, you get 1877, you have more railroads being built through Texas into West Texas. With those comes Asian workers, right? Asian workers working on the railroads. Some of those Asian workers stay, many do not, because of the very contentious racial dynamic in Texas. Plus you have that, the leftover fear of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the fear that they're going to come up to Mexico, right, and invade, this immigration invasion of Texas, of Asians. And so you have that leftover fear. So there's a very contentious relationship with Asian men, especially. There's more Asian men that are here because of the railroads, and then those that stay often open laundries, the laundries. And so, in all of the newspapers, which is very disturbing, especially for West Texas, they're calling for more steam laundries. They're calling for more white entrepreneurs to open these steam laundries. Please, please open these steam laundries. And it's specifically to push the Asian laundries out, the Chinese laundrymen out.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And let's give Dr. LaGrone a final applause.
Thank you.